Shabbat Shalom and welcome, whether you are joining us at Temple Beth David for the first time by participating in the Jewish Federation of Rochester's Plug into Peacefulness Shabbat program this weekend, whether some other road has led you here, or whether you are already a member of the Temple Beth David community and you're just coming home to our YouTube channel this Shabbat. Welcome to all of you. The concept of twins, or even larger multiple births, though let's stick with twins for the moment, the concept is fascinating. And I say this not just in a removed, dispassionate sense, but rather my own brother and sister are twins, so I hope they're not watching this. In any case, the idea that here are two individuals who enter the world at the same time, with the same genetic background, born into the same family, born into the same opportunities, to the extent that their identities are often conflated into a single unit. In years gone by, more so than today, they were often even dressed the same. Perhaps they're even jointly referred to by their group identity, the twins, instead of by their respective names. Yet another reality is that they are two different people, representing two distinct universes of possibility. And this is where it gets really interesting. In literature, twins often represent for us the possibility of overlap, through which we explore extreme opposite paradigms. Plays such as Shakespeare's The Comedy of Errors capitalize on plotting possibilities of people who can get away with switching places. We can transpose them, placing each in situations in which they themselves do not belong, sometimes with hilarious outcomes and other times with tragic outcomes. On the other hand, often these extremes represent good and evil. For example, we have the idea of the delinquent double, which was perhaps most memorably portrayed in Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Whether we focus on their sameness or on their difference, it seems to me that these are two sides of the same coin that represents the possibility and potential of human development to go in both directions. Inside of us, I really think that at a certain level, the bifurcation of twins represents the complexity of any single individual one of us, that it represents all of us who at some level have multiple personalities. We embody both good and evil, both black and white, as they're typically presented as extremes, as polarities. The unspoken goal in the presentation of good and evil, of these extremes, is of course a lifelong pursuit of that elusive sweet spot, the midpoint on that continuum, which is to achieve a sense of balance. And it's possible, just possible, that the foundation of this literary phenomenon is to be found in Torah, which brings us to Jacob and Esau, Yaakov ve'Esav. I think we ought to be uncomfortable with the depiction of them in Torah, that foundational, primordial Jewish teaching of how to live life as we know it. It sometimes seems more than ready to differentiate between twins, even more so, it blatantly discriminates between them. And I think that ought to appear immoral to us. We might even find ourselves questioning or confused by, at odds with, the morality of Torah at times. How could Torah possibly conjure up this scenario of paradigmatically presenting opposites in the same family, one of them acceptable and the other to be totally scorned? Why is it necessary for Torah to utilize these uncomfortable extremes and to play favorites? What lesson awaits for us in the wings? Modern psychology tells us today what Jewish mysticism has been telling us for centuries, that each of us is comprised of both of these extremes, that we all have the capacity for both, and that our challenge is to learn to harmonize between them, to gain control over our more destructive inclinations, and to keep each inclination in its appropriate place. We, each of us, are the embodiment of both, which is perhaps a whole lot more complicated and difficult to present in a single character than assigning each extreme to a separate individual. And maybe that is the point of this parable buried inside of Torah, which one takes literally at one's own risk. The Talmud, too, looks at the coexistence of conflicting points of views towards a single legal teaching, two completely different reactions evoked by a single principle. And it allows for the possibility that Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, both these and those are the words of the living God. It legitimizes duality and complexity, and so we should feel encouraged to allow for the possibility that Jacob and Esau, for all their commonality and also their mutual distinctiveness, we should allow for the possibility that they represent the possibility inherent inside the true nature of all of us. We see that it is a fundamental human experience to sometimes be the hunted and at other times the hunter, to be an exuberant person of the fields and in a different time and place to be a reflective, soulful person of God. Our tradition teaches us that King Solomon was the master author of all three works of the Song of Songs, the Book of Proverbs, and of Ecclesiastes. At first glance, the differing literary styles and topics would seem to make this claim impossible. But the mystery is partly solved by our sages, who explain that Song of Songs, which is filled with erotic metaphor for the relationship between God and Israel, that this was written by Solomon in his youth. That the Book of Proverbs, a collection of fables and wisdom about life, this he wrote when he was middle-aged. And Ecclesiastes, a much more sober book of contemplation and self-reflection, Solomon wrote in the autumn of his years. This also reminds me, once again, as I've spoken with you about before, it reminds me of the singer Joni Mitchell and her two different recordings of the song, Both Sides Now. First in 1967 at age 23, and again in 2000 when she was almost 60. The first recording, her sweet, youthful voice sings the lyrics, "I've looked at love from both sides now, from give and take, and still somehow it's love's illusions I recall. I really don't know love at all." And one can't help but think, you're 23, my dear. So no, you probably don't know love much at all. But the second, later recording is remarkably different. Not only has her voice been ravaged by smoking and she's lost a few octaves, but she's also attained a timbre, a patina that has been shaded by a life that's been lived and by loves that have been gained and lost. When this latter voice tells us it really doesn't know love at all, it's with an entirely different sense of authority and gravitas, a heaviness seemingly unrelated to the person who sang the same song 33 years before. And yet, in truth, it's just the other side of the same coin, hard as it may be for the listener to wrap their head around this. Even our biblical patriarch Isaac struggles with duality wrapped up in a single individual. He sends the flesh of his flesh and blood of his blood to be both a hunter, a person invested in the here and now of material existence, and yet cannot believe that this could possibly be a part of the same person as his other child is a spiritual person with the capacity of fostering a relationship with God and conveying this to an entire nation. And so he is truly shocked to discover that both of these can coexist with the confines of a single complex human being when Jacob tries to deceive him of this. And yet Jacob and Esau are one, as are two different sides of a single coin. And as Isaac knew from his own life, each of us is shaped and molded and changed by experience, capable of the most remarkable growth, as long as we are open to it, so that we are transformed into the possibility that looks very different to the places at which we start out. Elu ve'elu, divrei Elohim chayim. Both these and those are the words and the experience and the opportunities given to us by our living God. And ours is but to explore and discover, and ideally to strive to reach the midpoint, a place of balance. Shabbat Shalom.